The events you're about to see are based on real accounts. To protect the identities of those involved, names and details have been changed. My name is Keaton. I'm 34 years old and I live in Texas. This is one of those stories I wish I could forget, but whenever I see someone talking about animals perceiving things we can't, it brings back memories of what happened when I was younger. This happened back in 2002 when my parents decided to move into a bigger house after my younger brother was born. I was 12 at the time, and the new house seemed perfect. It had a huge yard, 2 floors, and an attic that I thought would be the perfect place to hide away when I needed some space. Cooper was a 2-year-old German Shepherd, rescued from a shelter. My parents wanted a guard dog, and he seemed perfect, strong, loyal, and incredibly intelligent. But from the first day in our house, we noticed something strange about his behavior. He explored the whole house without any problem, but he refused to go into the guest room. He would stop at the door, stare inside, and start growling, with the hair on his back raised. If anyone tried to pull him inside, he'd back off, his paws stiff as if he was refusing to enter. It wasn't something I could explain. Over time, it got weirder. Sometimes Cooper would walk up to the guest room door out of nowhere and start staring inside, standing completely still, like he was watching something that we couldn't see. I would get chills every time I saw him doing that. My parents laughed it off, saying he probably smelled a rat or something, but there was no explanation for why he would act like this with just that room. And the worst part, at night, he would get restless. Anytime someone passed by the guest room, he would start growling and barking at the door. He seemed afraid, like he was trying to warn us about something. One day, I decided to test something. I took a treat and tried to get him to follow me into the room. He followed me up to the door, but as soon as I tried to step inside, he froze and started whimpering, looking uneasy. I threw the treat inside, right by the bed, but Cooper didn't even try to get it. He just stood there, looking at the room with his ears drooping and his tail between his legs. Then, suddenly, he let out a loud bark and ran away like he had seen something move inside. My heart raced. I stepped into the room, turned on the light, and looked around, but there was nothing there. After that, I started avoiding that room. There was something off about it. It was a normal room with a bed, a wardrobe, and a dresser, but it always felt colder than the rest of the house, and the silence in there was different, heavy. My dad said it was because of the position of the window, which didn't get much sun during the day, but I wasn't convinced. Even our neighbors mentioned that the house had been empty for a long time before we bought it, like no one wanted to live there. The breaking point came one night, about 3 months after we moved in. I was sleeping when I woke up to a scratching noise coming from the hallway. It sounded like something was scraping its claws against the wood. I froze for a second, thinking it was Cooper, but I realized he was lying at the foot of my bed, tense, ears perked up, staring at the door. The noise continued for a few seconds, then silence. My throat was dry, but I gathered the courage to get up and open my bedroom door. The hallway was dark, with only a beam of light coming from the living room window. I looked toward the guest room, and that's when I saw Cooper standing in front of the door, completely bristled, growling. He was barking at the inside of the room, like there was something in there. My heart pounded. I turned on the hallway light and went over to the door, trying to see what was scaring him. The door was slightly ajar, but the room seemed empty. That's when I smelled it. A strange, old smell, like the air in that room had been stagnant for years. Cooper stayed there, growling low. I swallowed hard and took a step inside. Nothing. But the air was heavy, like I had entered a place I wasn't supposed to be. And then it happened. The door behind me slammed shut, all on its own. I ran out of there in a split second. My heart was pounding, and Cooper followed me, barking like crazy. We woke up the whole house. My parents came to see what was going on, and I could only tell them that the door slammed by itself. My dad, half asleep and annoyed, went over to check. He opened the door, looked around, tested the window, which was closed, shook his head, and said it was probably the wind. But there was no wind that night, not even a breeze. After that night, we avoided that room as much as possible. My parents turned it into a storage room, and no one ever slept in there. Cooper never stopped reacting like that to the room, and after a while, even my parents started feeling uncomfortable with it. I don't know if it was a coincidence, but 6 months later, my dad got a better job offer and we moved to a different house. He always said it was a great opportunity we couldn't pass up, but I still wonder if he felt something too and didn't want to admit it. I never found out what was in that room. No stories, no strange records. All I know is that on our last night in that house before the move, I saw Cooper standing by the guest room door for the last time. He stared inside for a long time in silence, and then, without making a sound, he turned and walked away. To this day, I don't know what he saw, but I'm sure I never want to find out. My name is Jason Miller. I am 38 years old, and I live in Portland, Oregon. I'm going to tell you something that happened to me about 5 years ago, but it still haunts me to this day. I know it might sound crazy, but it happened so intensely that if someone told me it was just a nightmare, I would probably believe them. Believe me, I still get chills just thinking about it. I had a cat at the time, Max. He was an ordinary white and black cat with a very laid-back personality. He was never one to do anything strange, always the typical cat that would nap on the couch or scratch at the curtains. But everything changed one weekend. I was home alone, sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone, when I started to notice that Max was acting a little differently. He was sitting on the rug, wide-eyed, staring into nothingness. I watched for a few seconds, thinking maybe he was just tired or perhaps bored, but things started to feel odd when he started following something with his eyes, moving from left to right, as if he was tracking something in motion. I looked around, but saw nothing. The air felt heavy, but I figured it was just my imagination. I tried to ignore it, but Max wouldn't stop looking at the space in front of him. That's when I felt a chill. I decided to approach him silently, just to see if he was seeing something I couldn't. When I got close enough, Max quickly turned his head to look at me, but his gaze... It was as if he knew something was there, but he didn't want me to see it. The strangest part was when he got up and started walking towards that something. He moved slowly toward the kitchen, his eyes still fixed on something that I couldn't see. I followed him, unsure of what was happening, but I needed to understand. I walked behind him, passing through the living room and into the kitchen. Max continued staring into the air, his fur on the back of his neck standing up. He approached the corner of the room and suddenly stopped. I stood there, waiting for a reaction. I was completely unsettled, but tried to stay calm. Then the cat started walking toward the back of the house, where my office was. He entered the room and sat down in front of a wall, staring into the empty space. I was scared, but I kept trying to rationalize everything. Maybe it was just a trick of the light or something silly the cat was seeing. But his behavior didn't seem normal. He was alert, wide-eyed, like he was waiting for something to appear. I sat in the chair next to him, trying to understand what he was seeing. For a moment, I almost felt like I was being watched by something that didn't belong there. Something invisible but present, in the same room with me. I looked at Max, and he slowly turned his head again, looking at me as if to say I still didn't understand what was going on. The tension in the room became unbearable. I didn't know what to do, so I went into the kitchen to try and clear my head. After that, I started to notice Max doing the same thing every day. For hours, he would sit in a corner of the house, staring into empty space, as if following something with his eyes, but there was nothing there. I began to pay closer attention, and every day it seemed like he was getting more fixated on something. I was starting to feel a little lost. Was the cat seeing something I couldn't? Sometimes he would stay perfectly still, almost as if he was in a trance, and I didn't know whether I should be worried or not. I decided to do some research because this was driving me crazy. It wasn't normal. I googled strange cat behavior, and although there were some explanations about cats fixating on invisible spots due to light or sounds that humans can't hear, none of it explained Max's persistent and intense behavior. I even watched videos of people talking about it, but nothing seemed to match what I was experiencing. Then one night, something even stranger happened. Max was in the hallway, staring at a spot on the wall. I watched him for a while until, out of nowhere, he jumped at the wall. as if trying to reach something. I was startled because there was nothing there. He scratched at the air desperately, as though trying to catch something invisible. I quickly got up and went to him. When I touched him, he seemed to be in a panic, but there was nothing there. I was beginning to lose my grip on reality. At that moment, something became clear to me. It wasn't just the cat. I could feel it too. There was something there, even though I couldn't see it. Max was just more sensitive, more in tune with whatever it was. I knew he wasn't imagining things. The cat was following something invisible, something he was starting to fear. And if he was scared, maybe I should be too. I tried to ignore what was happening. I tried to go on with my routine, but Max's behavior never changed. He kept following something invisible around the house, and the more I saw it, the more uncomfortable I felt. To this day, I can't explain what it was. The cat was never the same after that period, and although he continued living with me for a while, he never again acted that way. Even now, I think about that time. I don't know if Max was seeing something real, or if he was just reacting to something I couldn't perceive. Maybe it was some presence or energy passing through our house, but the fact is, since that day, everything felt quieter, heavier. I never truly understood what happened, but I've never told anyone about it until now. My name is Gideon, I'm 34 years old, and I live in a house in the countryside of Pennsylvania. I'm not a superstitious person, nor do I believe in things beyond what we can see and touch. But what happened that day changed my view on many things, and to this day it haunts me. I've always enjoyed being at home, soaking up the quiet in my little yard. I had a well-kept garden, and right in the middle of the yard, there was an old tree, an imposing oak. When I moved there, the tree seemed like a good place for shade in the summer and had a unique presence. However, something strange started happening. Over time, I noticed that the birds, which used to frequent my garden, began to avoid the tree. I didn't pay much attention to it after all. Maybe it was just the weather or something else. What made me more attentive to this was the behavior of my pets. I had 2 cats and a dog, all very calm and full of energy. But as days passed, I realized they started avoiding that tree. The dog, who loved to play in the yard, simply wouldn't go near it. The cats, who usually wandered around every corner of the garden, started avoiding the area in a strange way, even without any clear reason. I watched this for a few days and it started to get to me. One morning, I decided to sit on the rocking chair in my yard, trying to relax and enjoy the cool breeze. I was reading a book, but I couldn't help but notice the silence. There were no birds singing as usual, and the dog, who usually rolled in the grass or sniffed everything, was just standing still, looking at the tree from a distance. That's when I heard something. It wasn't a loud sound, but a kind of murmur? Something subtle, as if the wind had carried a strange sound from over there, from the tree. I stood up, trying to understand what it could be. I decided to investigate. I walked over to the tree and stopped beside it, trying to find some rational explanation. The bark of the tree felt strangely rough, like it had aged even more in recent months, but it didn't seem diseased. I looked around and noticed that the soil around the tree was drier. The fallen leaves, usually a sign of the fall season, were strangely compacted, as if something had passed by repeatedly but without leaving clear traces. Then I tried something. I placed bird food near the tree. Normally, in a matter of minutes, the garden would be full of small birds, but that day nothing happened. I didn't see a single bird approach, and the strangest part was that when I backed off and observed from a distance, I noticed that the birds, which usually flew over the garden, were diverting their flight, going around that tree in a systematic way. That's when I decided to search for an explanation, but the most unsettling thing was that, no matter how much I tried, I couldn't find anything about trees causing this kind of effect on birds or animals. No books, no websites, no stories or myths that spoke of something like that. I asked neighbors if they had noticed anything, but they all looked at me as if I was going crazy. The only thing I got was a vague story from an elderly woman who lived in the house before mine. She mentioned something. One night, after a long day of work, I decided to go into the yard again, and that's when the strangest thing happened. I was walking toward the tree, trying to understand what was going on, when I heard a whisper, something that didn't make sense. There was no wind, there was no one around, and yet I clearly heard a sound coming from the tree. It was like a lament. It was a sound that, to this day, gives me chills just remembering it. I ran inside and didn't go back to the yard at night. My animal's behavior got worse. The dog refused to go to the yard, and the cats started acting in an increasingly strange way. They hid during the day and spent the night in places far away from the tree. I decided to stop messing with the tree, stop investigating, but the feeling that something was wrong never left me. I never told anyone about it because I feared they'd think I was losing my mind. But I know what I felt. I know what I saw and heard. The feeling of being watched, the strange stillness in the air, the way everything seemed to avoid that place. Today, years later, the tree is still there. I don't get close to it anymore, but the birds still avoid it. The animals, even though they're no longer with me, had the same behavior. When I talk to other people in the town, I feel there's this uncomfortable energy when the tree is mentioned. No one ever says anything, but they all know what I'm talking about. I can't explain what happened with that tree, but I'm sure something was there, something that couldn't be ignored. And to this day, I don't know what it was. That was over 5 years ago, but every time I look at the tree, a chill runs down my spine. I don't know if it was something paranormal or just a coincidence, but I know that day, something was there. And something still is. My name is Marcus Hendricks. I am 38 years old and I live on an isolated farm in Kansas, United States. What I'm about to tell you happened about 15 years ago, but to this day I still can't understand what really happened that night. Maybe it's the kind of story you only share when you feel in some way that you need to get something off your chest. Or maybe you're just looking for an explanation. But honestly, I still don't know what to think. I've always taken care of my animals, and my horse, Cody, was the most docile of them all. Since I bought him, he's always been calm. He was the type of horse you could trust with anything. I used him for rides and even to work on the farm. I never thought he was capable of anything out of the ordinary, but that was before those nights. It was a hot summer afternoon, maybe around 30 degrees Celsius, when I first noticed something strange. It was getting close to sunset, and I was preparing the animals to head into the barn. Cody, as always, was by my side, waiting for me to guide him to his stable. But that night, he didn't want to leave the field. I didn't know what was happening because his behavior was completely different. Instead of walking calmly to the barn like he always did, he suddenly stopped, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance. He stood there, as if he were listening to something. I tried calling him, but he didn't respond. I thought maybe he was just tired or uncomfortable, so I began pulling him closer to me, but he resisted. And that's when it happened. Cody suddenly started neighing in such a loud and intense way that it almost made me jump in fright. He turned his head with a speed that wasn't normal and then began to move away, pulling the reins so hard that I almost fell off. He was trying to run as if something was terrifying him. What puzzled me the most was that he wasn't just nervous, he was genuinely scared, and that was something I'd never seen in him before. I tried to calm Cody down and thought maybe it was some kind of horse nightmare, who knows, maybe he'd seen a wild animal or something like that. But when I looked toward the barn, I saw that there was nothing there. There was nothing that would explain Cody's fear. Still, he didn't want to get close to the barn. He seemed more and more desperate, and things only got worse when the night began to fall. I knew I couldn't leave Cody out there, so I decided to guide him inside again, trying to be firm but always careful, because I knew he was in a panic. But when we passed through the barn door, he simply refused to go in. He raised his front legs and slammed them against the ground in a frantic manner. I was starting to get worried, but nothing could prepare my heart for what came next. At that moment, I heard a sound coming from inside the barn. It wasn't something you'd normally associate with a barn, like the sound of wood creaking or the noise of animals moving. It was a low whisper, but unnatural. It was as if something was inside, calling to me, or maybe calling Cody. But the strangest thing was that the sound didn't seem to come from one fixed place. It seemed to echo throughout the barn. The most terrifying part was when I realized that Cody didn't want to go anywhere near that sound. I was already starting to feel nervous, so I decided to go inside alone without Cody. Maybe if I went in, I could figure out what was causing all that fear. When I entered, the atmosphere in the barn was completely different. It wasn't cold nor hot, but there was something in the air that felt heavy, as if the air was charged with an indescribable tension. Inside, everything seemed normal: the hay, the tools, the piled up logs. But then I heard it again. A whisper, but this time it was clearer. I couldn't identify what it was saying, but it sounded like a name, as if someone was calling me. I quickly turned around, but I didn't see anyone. The barn was empty. The sound was coming from a dark corner where the shadows were thicker. I couldn't see anything there, but the sound was there. I could feel it in my bones. I ran out of the barn, my heart pounding in my chest as if it was about to explode. Cody was standing outside, still restless and completely terrified. He didn't approach, as if he was telling me without words to stay away from that place. I knew something wasn't right, but the worst was yet to come. The next night, Cody's behavior repeated. I tried to get him to go inside, but once again he refused, neighing and resisting with all his strength. I spent hours trying to convince him, but there was no way. And once again I heard the whisper coming from the barn. I didn't know what to do anymore, but deep down I knew it wasn't normal. Cody was right to stay away. In the following days, his behavior grew stranger. When the sun started to set, he would get agitated, even before I got near the barn, as if he knew somehow that the night would bring something. After a few days, I decided not to force him anymore. I just left him in the pasture at night. He'd stand there, near the fence, staring at the barn, always in silence. I think, deep down, I knew something was there, something Cody sensed and I couldn't understand. Eventually, after a few weeks, Cody's behavior returned to normal. He went into the barn without hesitation, as if nothing had happened. But to this day, when the night falls, I still hear the whisper from time to time. And I know that if I close my eyes, I can feel the weight of Cody's fear, something he sensed that I will never understand. I could never explain what happened in that barn. Cody, my faithful friend, was never the same again, and neither was I. Whatever happened that night, it stayed with me, like a secret I share with anyone who might want to listen. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like to support the community. And if you're not subscribed yet, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new content. See you next time.